Hi there, and welcome to video number 1 in the Demands and Struggles in the Colonies unit. That's the unit we started just before March break. By the end of today's lesson, you are going to be able to answer 3 essential questions. The first is, what is a nation? You're going to be able to answer this question by listing some of the elements of a nation and by being able to define it. The second essential question we are going to be answering today is what are liberal values, and also how these values were represented in the Constitutional Act of 1791. The third essential question we're going to be able to answer by the end of today's lesson is how were liberal values represented in the Constitutional Act of 1791 territorially, politically, as well as in the structure of government under the Constitutional Act. Today's lesson should be fun, educational, and a new experience for everyone. Please watch the video, and I hope you like it. Our first essential question was, what is a nation? And so we had a good conversation where we said we all understand this idea of nationhood, but to define it sometimes can be a little bit tricky. So if you look at this map, you'll see different countries located throughout the world. But really what the question was is, what makes somebody a part of, say, the country of Canada, the United States, Brazil, Russia, Germany, Australia? You get the point. Well, what we came up with was a collective definition. A definition that said, a nation is a group of people who share a common territory and are united by similarities in culture, history, language, politics, beliefs, values, and a sense of belonging. It's really important to understand this definition because if you think back to the province of Quebec in the late 1700s after the arrival of the Loyalists, what you now begin to see is that you have 3 distinct groups of people. We have the British colonists, we have the Loyalists, and we have the French-speaking Canadiens, all living in the same area, in the province of Quebec. So all 3 groups are being connected by a common territory, Quebec. But it's really important to note that the British colonists, the Loyalists, and the Canadiens all had very different values. And so what you were beginning to see in the province of Quebec was that you had 3 distinct groups of people who were trying to live together, and the idea of a nation may have been difficult to come up with because you have 3 different groups of people who may not have similarities in all of the things that we just discussed in the definition. What is interesting, however, is the fact that all 3 groups of people did share one common value, and that was liberalism. So let's answer our next essential question. What is liberalism? And what are its values? So we came up with the collective definition in class before the break that liberalism is a political concept that is based on individual freedom. More or less, it's an idea that each and every person deserves the right to speak their mind and to have a voice. You have to remember that in Europe at this time, there was a philosophical movement that had been put into play for nearly 150 years in terms of humanism, and so people really began to think for themselves, and you really began to see this way of thinking permeate itself into politics. So liberalism came to be. What are its values? Well, liberalists value the following things. They value the freedom of expression, equality, participation in the exercise of power, the right to vote, freedom of belief, and religion. Although all are extremely important values in liberalism, today we're going to be looking at a couple of them. We're going to be looking at freedom of expression. We'll be discussing equality. We'll talk a little bit about the exercise of power and the importance of voting. Each of these values could be seen in government in 1791, which we'll get to in just a moment. Our next essential question is, were liberal values represented in government in 1791? To answer that question, let's first examine what society was like leading up to 1791 and the signing of the Constitutional Act. So, leading up to that date, people living in the province of Quebec were growing increasingly frustrated because part of liberal values was self-expression and equality. Neither of those two things could be seen in the province of Quebec, especially in terms of government. So in 1784, the people living in the province of Quebec sent a formal protest to the King of England demanding that certain changes be made to government so that they could have self-expression, equality, and really just a voice in government. Fast forward 7 years, and the King of England decides to sign the Constitutional Act of 1791. A big part of the Constitutional Act is that the King of England decided that he would make certain provisions to the government of the province of Quebec. Provisions is just a fancy word for making changes. So that's awesome. They're going to make changes to the government of the province of Quebec. But before we jump into how things changed in government, let's first take just a very quick look at another change that took place in the province of Quebec before government. In terms of territory, the province of Quebec actually divided its territory into two distinct boundaries after the Constitutional Act got signed in 1791. What we now began to see was that Quebec got divided into Lower and Upper Canada. Lower Canada can be seen in blue right here, and Upper Canada can be seen in green right here. All the red land that you see in the map would one day become part of the Federation of Canada, but that's years down the road. In yellow, what you see is the portion of territory that belonged to the United States, because if you remember, by this point, the U.S. is now its own independent country. So that was the change made to territory. But let's get back to the changes made in government. So with the signing of the Constitutional Act, the public finally was going to be getting a voice in government. That voice came in the form of the Legislative Assembly, which is also known as the elected assembly. So whenever you see Legislative Assembly, you got to think that that's like the voice of the people. That's where voters could elect representatives to carry out their demands that would then be taken to other parties in the government. So the public votes in the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly was then responsible for bringing the public's demands to either the Legislative or Executive Council. Items related to sort of everyday living, like policies, were brought to the Legislative Council. Any issues related to laws, I'm talking justice, was brought to the Executive Council. Either the Executive Council or Legislative Council, depending on what the concern was, would then take that demand to the governor. Now, although the public was now given a voice in the form of the Legislative Assembly, it's really important to note that many of the ideas and demands that were brought to the councils were often shut down, rejected, also known as vetoed. And so, although liberal values meant that self-expression was important, they also said equality was important. And unfortunately, in this particular form of government, it was great that the Legislative Assembly was the voice of the people or the public, but it didn't really hold all that much power in government because any ideas that were brought forth could be vetoed or rejected. So let's go back to our essential question now. The essential question, once again, asked if liberal values represented government in 1791. Well, if we take a look at some of the values we just discussed about liberalism, one of which was freedom of expression, I think it's fair to say that the Legislative Assembly served as the medium for freedom of expression. Because don't forget, the public needed a voice, so they voted in or elected that Legislative Assembly. That legislative assembly served to be the voice. So in terms of freedom of expression, I would say it's fair to say that yes, we can give a check mark and say yes, that liberal value was represented in government. But now let's ask the question of equality, because that's also a liberal value. Now, was equality represented in government in 1791? Well, if we look back here for just a moment, what you'll see is that the Executive and Legislative Council held more power than the Legislative Assembly, and the governor held more power than the Legislative Assembly as well. If you think back to vetoing, it meant that although ideas could be brought forth, they could really just be rejected on a whim because other people in the government had more power. So if that's the case, I think it's fair to say then that in some ways, was equality really represented in government in 1791? In this case, I think we can agree no. I hope you enjoyed our first video on the demand and struggles in the British colony. Before I go, let's just have a quick recap of our essential questions, learning intentions, and success criteria. So the essential question was, what is a nation? You'll be able to determine whether or not you learn that concept by being able to list the main elements of a nation. Next, the essential question was, what are liberal ideas? So what is liberalism? In order to show me that you learn that concept, you will be able to indicate the origins of liberal ideas. You should be able to name some liberal values, and you need to be able to explain how liberal values were reflected in political demands at that time. Finally, we just asked how liberal values were represented in the Constitutional Act of 1791. In order to indicate that you have learned that, you must meet the success criteria, the first of which is that you can indicate some of the territorial boundaries of Upper and Lower Canada in 1791. You can name some of the political institutions that were introduced in the Constitutional Act. You can explain the political structure of the Constitutional Act and define some of the powers of the different actors or groups. And finally, you need to be able to analyze the structure of government under the Constitutional Act in 1791 in light of liberal values. Thanks, and have a great day.